Ruthann, when did you first decide to become an archaeologist, and were there any particular experiences that led you to decide to pursue archaeology?
Well, I went to Mesa Verde in 1961, 62, and that was when Weatherill Mesa was being excavated. And I got introduced to archaeology at Mesa Verde, and I got introduced to Weatherill, to research, to lots and lots of exciting questions. In addition to all the evening campfire drinking, which there was a lot of, there were lots of discussions about the Southwest, about Mesa Verde, about archaeology, about how you did archaeology too. There was a range of, physical anthropology, cultural anthropology, dirt archaeology. I was a student at St. Paul, Minnesota at that point, and Hamlin had no anthropology. So I proceeded to get in a phone booth at Mesa Verde and call Hamlin and withdraw from school. And my father hit the ceiling. And so he drove from Duluth, Minnesota to St. Paul, got my records at Hamlin, drove to Minnesota, enrolled me at Minnesota, and I became an anthropology undergraduate at the University of Minnesota. And I was with E. Adamson Hobel and Eldon Johnson and an absolutely incredible faculty. So therefore, I am what I am.
Great. And were visits to national parks part of your childhood, and did they affect your choice?
Oh, definitely. Because I grew up, I was born in Milwaukee, and I grew up in Duluth, Minnesota. My father was a canoe guide, CCC camp counselor in the 30s. I grew up in the northern border lakes, what's now Voyages National Park. It wasn't then. When I was a teenager, we took the proverbial family trip, and we went north and across Canada to Glacier and down to Yellowstone, the Grand Tetons. When we were in Milwaukee, we were over at Sleeping Dunes. I just was around those parks a lot as a kid coming back through them.
And when is it that you realized, when you sort of got a feel for the idea that parks were both natural resources and historical or archaeological resources? Was that your trip to Mesa Verde, or?
Oh, no, earlier. Mm-hmm. When I was in high school, to celebrate my senior high school trip, my mother, father, and brother and I went up to the Canadian Border Lakes. And it was wonderful as a kid growing up there. You never knew what country you were in. Nobody ever worried about it. You know, you were out there with a canoe and the loons and the beavers. And I remember walking around some of those far north countries that were canoe country and finding old railroads and old log cabins. Mm-hmm. And I knew that despite this being a wilderness, this was a cultural landscape. I didn't probably have that term at that point. Right. But I knew that you couldn't separate the people from that. I'd also grown up with Indian kids all my childhood, teenage life. And people lived in all those woods. So I knew that it all went together. You couldn't separate them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, neat. So what was your educational experience like? Did you have any particularly influential mentors? You described some of the mentors you had at Minnesota, but...
Well, generally they were, of course, all males. That was the 60s. But I had an undergraduate psychology professor at Hamlin University, Dr. Theda Wolf. She's a wonderful person. And she called me into her office one day about something, and she told me she thought I ought to get a PhD. Now, my parents both had master's degree, but I had never thought about it before. And I really hadn't thought I had the capacity or capability. I did after that. She just persuaded me. At Minnesota, I had Ad Hobel, I had Eldon Johnson, I had Jim Gibbs, who was one of the first black cultural anthropologists. He was fresh out of Harvard. Richard E.W. Adams, who was fresh out of Harvard. And Dick was an interesting person, but he taught me about ceramics and the type variety system and things that were coming out of Harvard that I would never have learned at Minnesota. And consequently, I did a very different master's thesis under Eldon Johnson that I wouldn't have done if I hadn't had that theoretical background from other people. it was a good time to be. I remember I was doing Cambria. It's probably early Dakota, but it's about 1200 AD site, southern Minnesota, for a thesis. And Jim Griffin had some pots from Cambria at Michigan. He came to give a lecture at Minnesota, and he carried those 2 pots on his lap on the plane. And they had the rim sherds and the body sherds fitted back together. Nothing in the Minnesota collections had those 2 fit together. And that, to me, was the complete solution to Cambria, because the rims were more Middle Mississippian. The rims were more plainsy, and the bodies were more Middle Mississippian, out of which came my description and understanding of the Cambria collection, which is still standing pretty much today.
Great. And you said that, well,
and then Jim came to Washington State University, too, when I was first there. So that gave me continuity over the years of sitting and actually at his feet talking to Jimmy about various things. It's a great way to learn theory.
Yeah. We talked a little bit about Washington State University, which had a very rich interdisciplinary scholarship and an early applied program. Can you talk about your cohort there and how you've kept in contact with them a bit?
Yeah, Dick Doherty decided that he was going to establish a PhD program at Washington State. In the 60s, the only PhD program in anthropology up in the Pacific Northwest, in Washington was Washington State, because there was one at Oregon too. And Dick had rules. He would only allow you to apply to the program if you already had one significant publication and if you had your dissertation topic defined and knew what you were going to do with it. It was a formidable challenge. And the first year I was there, 68, Franklin Hardy, Benny Keel, a couple of others came in 67. They were the first 4 people, I think. I came in 68 and I was the only girl, which made for an interesting life. When I took my soils classes, Henry Smith would give me the keys to the car because we were out in the middle of the Palouse wheatlands, and I would have to drive 10 miles to a bathroom because, the guys could relieve themselves on the side of the road and I wasn't allowed. But the second year in 69, 5 more women came, and I made darn sure that I had a party for them right away. And we all got acquainted. We all came from very different backgrounds. We really developed a strong bonding, which Franklin Hardy several years later named Doherty's Daughters. And to this day, we're still, there's 2 have died. Janet Friedman's gone. Leslie Willison's gone. The rest of the 4 of us are still a strong cohort after nearly a half century.
Wow. So on the topic of women in archaeology, were there supportive female professionals in archaeology that, you mentioned a psychology professor, but in archaeology who might have encouraged you to pursue a career? And could you just characterize a level of support for women in the discipline when you began your career? And maybe, well...
Eldon Johnson was generally a supporter, but there were a couple of women at Minnesota, graduate students who got master's degree. I don't think any got PhDs. But other than Eldon, his personality, it wasn't a reality. At Pullman, there were no women on the faculty, but all of us, we came from such strong backgrounds. Benny was a state archaeologist in North Carolina. Dave was a state archaeologist in Texas. Don was a state archaeologist in Oklahoma. We were all such a group who learned so much from each other that was the supportive group for women without having women on the faculty. And I was adopted, sort of, by Marie Worthington back in 66 or so when I was teaching in Colorado between my graduate degrees. And Marie was a strong supporter but she wanted me to be emotionally tied to her, and that I had my own mom who was real good, you know. So Marie was strong, but I wrote my dissertation on Plainview and then the McAfee Scottsbluff materials. Marie was not comfortable with my interpretation of Plainview, so that cooled the mentorship. I think it's very difficult for women at that time to really support other women. You know, we're all in such a competitive world. I will say some of my strongest supporters were, I went to my first Plains conference in 1964, and I just glommed on to all the other female graduate students and the few faculty members that were there. Some of my closest friends have been the women who came out of Harvard in the late 50s and early 60s. Jane Kelly and Alice Kehoe and, you know, some of the others. Because we formed our own cohort, our own learning and support group, because it just wasn't there in the faculty at that point yet. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's interesting. Excellent. Let's see.
He's reading the cheat sheet.
Got it. What were your other career options like when you chose? Your first job, I guess. What kind of career options did you have when you came out of grad school, and how did you make those choices?
Well, without going into all of the details, I had been married briefly, and my ex-husband had blacklisted me. So academically, I could not get a job when I finished my PhD. CRM was just being created. The Leip-Lindsay Denver Symposium had just been held there. I ended up getting a job at the University of Idaho because they had an archaeological collection, a Park Service River Basin Survey collection that had never been written up. And so MidWAC provided some funds, a contract, and I got the job of writing up the Anton Rig site from North Dakota as part of that whole deal. And from there, I got a National Science Foundation grant to work on red smoke, and George Frizen and Vance Haynes were very supportive of that. When that money ran out, I stayed at the University of Idaho in what became CRM, because that's where the work was. People were coming to university asking them for Forest Service campground surveys and Corps of Engineers dam projects. And I was there. So I got tapped to be the first CRM archaeologist at the University of Idaho, which was an interesting experience.
Yeah, so you saw this big change as legislation and funding and motivation for all this compliance work really appeared.
Oh, yeah, I was there because the first thing I had to do was learn all the laws. I still have a notebook sitting over here that has the list, 3-page single-spaced list I generated of the laws, the CFRs, the stats, all of that. Because, first of all, if you're going to get into a new game and you're an anthropologist, you learn the anthropology, the social structure, the language, the concepts of that new world so that you can operate successfully in it. You know, so I had to learn all those regulations so I could then use them in dealing with the Corps and the Forest Service, occasionally the Park Service, I think, at Nez Perce, as to what the law was, what we could do, what we had to do, what they had to pay us to do to get the work done, to get the permits. And that's how I got involved in politics, because I'd come out of Washington State with Dick Doherty, who was the archaeopolitician par excellence. Then I had to learn all of this while I was at Idaho. And then the Society for American Archaeology with Hester Davis and Bob McGimsey and others were beginning to get active, and I got recruited right away and was enthusiastic about getting involved in that. I will say just one thing, too. Idaho is a small population state. You have very good, easy access to your senators and your congressmen. And I had very easy access to Senators Frank Church and Jim McClure, who were very senior at the Senate. And consequently, when I went in and talked to them, they listened to me, and I was able to work my way into that system and get some things done.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Neat. Let's talk a little bit about early research experiences, working on field crews and then managing field crews and research design things. Can you talk about some of the formative learning moments that you had, field schools, and then leadership roles? Or
You know, I'm a girl, and so as a girl, I was mostly in the lab. I did Cambria as a laboratory thesis. When I got to Pullman, then I got into it. Pullman is, I didn't mention this to her, it was an explicitly interdisciplinary program. We had a geologist, an ecologist, a paleontologist, all within the anthropology department. So my coursework was with Roald Fritzell learning geomorphology and Carl Gustafson learning fauna. Originally Vaughn Bryant, then Pete Meringer learning pollen, though I must admit I never learned much of that. And I didn't do field work. I found myself at Idaho running field crews. And I was very blessed because Dave Dibble from Texas and Tom Roll from Montana had sent over some graduate students that they had trained. They were dirt archaeologists. So I had crews where I could manage the business end. I could come in and do it, but they ran a lot of the field work while I did a lot of the other administrative and management work. I mean, I've done some, but it's not my forte. My strength is doing the synthetic work. It's doing the drawings, the analysis of the artifacts. It's putting the big picture together, making sure there's quality control of the lab work, of the field work as well as lab work. But I probably fairly typical of women in that area, and I must say that I love it.
Right. Cool, thank you. So let's talk a little bit about your National Park Service career, and we'll just start by talking about, can you characterize the institutional or social atmosphere for women working in the Park Service when you began your career, and maybe a bit about how it changed across the years? Oh, without getting into anything.
No, when I
graduated
from Minnesota in 1963, and I had been at Mesa Verde for 2 years and Yellowstone for 1, and I wanted to be a ranger. I really wanted to be a ranger. So the first place I applied to, of course, was Mesa Verde, and I'm going to forget her name. Anyway, the chief ranger told me that she wouldn't even consider my application because she didn't have dormitory space for girls. I applied for, I think, 15 parks, and I only got, everybody said no, they wouldn't even consider it. And I did get accepted at Bandelier National Monument. I drove from Minnesota to New Mexico, and I walked into Bandelier, and I walked up to the desk, and the chief ranger was there, and I said, I'm Ruthann Knudson, I'm the ranger, and he said, look, girlie, I want you to know that you don't belong here. We don't need girls in this place. You just remember that this summer. And he proceeded to remind me of that throughout the summer. It just wasn't much fun, you know. Now, the guys I worked with were great, but there was nothing in the institution that really supported that, you know. When I was doing contract work with the Park Service in the 80s, I was coming from the private industry side. I was providing the work. Park Service was providing the money, and they were quite happy to give me a lot of money if I provided the product that they needed, so that there was no question of whether you're male, female, purple or pink or whatever, you know. Over the years, when I came back to the Park Service in 1990, I was in a different role. I was fairly senior at that point. It wasn't a comfortable environment. And I had worked with Connie Ramirez, Dr. Constance Ramirez, at in the 80s doing the DARCOM contracts when I was at Woodward Clyde. So soon after I got to AAD with Frank McManaman, Connie came, and the Legacy program had just been passed Congress. And Connie said, "Oh, Ruthann, you've got to come work on Legacy with me." So she arranged with Frank for me to be essentially detailed to the Department of the Army, Department of Defense for much of my first several years. That wasn't real comfortable to the Park Service, I don't think. It wasn't their world. But I will say that external programs are very, very different, I think, than the park system itself. There are many, many more women in the external programs. There always have been. There are women in leadership roles there. Personalities drive it as well as there is in the park system. But when I got into the park system in 1995, 6, I guess it was, I really wanted to get out of Washington, D.C., partly because I'm a Westerner. I just wasn't my thing, you know. So I took a downgrade to go to Agate Fossil Beds, which I absolutely loved, and I was there for 9 years. But I knew all the park system green and gray rules, and I just hadn't been taught them. And there was a very different attitude in the park system than I had approached in many places in the external programs. I think things have changed. There are some strong women and strong men in the National Park Service, but I still think that the, 19th, 20th century military model in which the Park Service is based still applies to a lot of the mentality of the Park Service. And I think women have a rougher time.
Okay, yeah. On a positive note, can you talk about your most engaged, exciting, or memorable experience in the Park Service career?
There's two. One's related to the Park Service and one's in the Park Service.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I think in the Park Service, probably it was when I was superintendent at Agate, and I was responsible for the NAGPRA consultations for all the skeletal remains at Scottsbluff and Agate monuments. And we had, I believe it was 34 or 35 tribes with which we were consulting, because so many tribes that live on the edge of the plains come out into the plains to hunt. So we had lots of people, lots of tribes to consult with. And having been in Washington when NAGPRA was passed, and having been involved in repatriation in the 70s in Idaho, I knew that as superintendent of the park, I represented the President of the United States in my interactions with tribes, and that I had to mind my P's and Q's and be very respectful and try to get a meeting of the minds of all these various people about the treatments of these remains that we had. We had, I can't remember the numbers, but I think we had ultimately 18 sets of remains in 17 tribes that we dealt with. And I think one of the most exciting times was sitting up at Fort Robinson State Park in northwest Nebraska with tribal members, including some children and wives from 14 tribes, first day of our consultation meeting, with a thunderstorm coming across the Pine Ridge, and the Lakota and Cheyenne kids playing their drums and singing songs, eating bison ribeye steaks, and having all the tribal members feel like they had some control and some power there. It was an electric moment. It was an exciting moment. And to me, that's one of the most important parts of good NAGPRA consultation, is because if you're blessed, you make friends and you develop relationships. It doesn't always work. But by George, you can come to a common ground, and you can be truly an anthropologist. You can be truly a cultural participant. And to me, that was exciting. Now, there's one other exciting moment, and that was when I was not in the Park Service, but I was passing Park Service legislation. In 1980, the group of us worked on the 1980 amendments to the National Historic Preservation Act. there were 4 of us women sitting in the lobby of the Senate chambers. At the end of that session, it was on a unanimous consent calendar. There were 2 senators on the whole floor of the Senate, Orrin Hatch from Utah and Jim McClure from Montana. And Hatch went up there and he presented the 1980 amendments, and he just put it on the podium and he said, "I move we pass this bill." And he and Jim said, "We concur," and that bill passed. And that's when we put archaeology in the National Historic Preservation Act. It was just, I can't really describe it. It was awesome. It was like another world. It was so simple, and yet it was so very, very complicated.
Had you worked very hard leading up to that, though? I mean,
yes.
Write and make phone calls and.
What we did, I set up a program. I became the legislative coordinator for SAA a year before, and I set a system in part because I inherited from Hester Davis, and so that we had one. I forgot what we call the person. I don't know. Legislative person in each state, in all the 50 states and the territories. And that person was our contact point. And the agreement was, and we contacted everybody at least once a month, sometimes more often. And that was mostly by telephone. Emails weren't that common then. And the agreement was that state coordinator would call 3 other people, and each of those people would call 3 other people. And in the 24 or 48 hours before Hatch walked that bill up to that podium, he had 400 cards, letters, and phone calls from Utah constituents to pass that bill. It's taking a community and putting it together and sharing responsibility in ways that you can handle that really make a difference.
Right. Excellent. Yeah, I mentioned before we started this that I read your piece from '84, Ethical Decision Making and Participation in the Politics of Archaeology. So it must have been a very exciting time to be talking about those issues, I'm sure, with the community. In retrospect, how do you think about that today? Do we still have responsibility as archaeologists?
We always have. We always have responsibilities. I would say that year, too, when I was in D.C., things sort of came together because Bill Leip and I had been working in central Idaho wilderness. Frank Church and Jim McClure were bringing up the Central Idaho Wilderness Act. I went to Church and then McClure and was talking about all of the cultural resources in that wilderness, everything from Paleoindian prehistoric thing to historic mining cabins. And Jim asked me to write a paragraph in the bill, and consequently Section 8 in the Frank Church Central Idaho Wilderness Act declares that entire wilderness a cultural preserve. They can't do a thing. I think the Forest Service isn't too happy with me, but that's okay. But we got that passed. I got invited to the White House for the signing of that, and that was exciting. We also had the Dolores Bill, where the Dolores Archaeological Project had been, the project had been authorized to be built, but the monies had not been authorized for the archaeology. Under the Moss Bennett, 1% of project funds could be expended, but the project cost 2%, and they were running out of money. And I was back and forth D.C. at that point, and I used my old WASO connections, Doherty connections, and I contacted Scoop Jackson and told him the problem, and it was the University of Colorado contract, and he said, "Well, that's not my problem." Well, his staffer said that, not him, you know. And I said, "Well, we just fired 100 Washington State University employees yesterday." And he said, "Oh." And Jackson walked that bill through. It was 3 paragraphs 2 days later. You know, those are exciting things, but the thing we have a responsibility for, I think, through our society is to monitor that the agencies have the authorization and the appropriations they need to do the job that we as archaeologists think need to be done, whether it's in the parks or it's on BLM lands, it's on Department of Defense lands, because nobody else is going to do it but us.
Mm-hmm. Right. Cool.
Nobody has any questions.
I have one.
Yeah,
Can you hear
okay.
me? You didn't include the DARCOM project as an important aspect of your career.
Well, Mark.
It's more fun.
Yes. May I respond?
Yeah, please.
Okay. DARCOM is the Department of the Army and Materiel Command. And that was the contract that I mentioned a little earlier when I was in Washington, D.C. in the 80s when I went to sign a $100,000 contract, and I think I walked out with a $6,000 contract. And the Park Service had a contract by the Department of the Army, and that was Connie Ramirez, to do archaeological overviews and management plans for all the Army plants, where they have these big Army igloos full of ammo all over the United States. I ended up with, and Mark is the contractor, that's why he's asking about it. I ended up with writing the work plan for the whole national project and then supervising 4 subcontractors, and I think we did 39 of those Army ammo
41.
plans. 41. Okay.
Yeah. We had the majority of them.
We had the majority. And coming back from the Plains Conference last week, I drove past Cornhusker Army.
Oh, wow.
And it was exciting to think I'd been a part of that, even, there are cows on it. But those are the kinds of projects, as I look back over my lifetime, that was a Park Service contract. I was a private contractor. But that, for me, was as much part of being the Park Service, as it was when I was in WASO, whether I was an Agate, whether I was a ranger. Because I had to learn part of that whole system, and an anthropologist within the Park Service system while I was doing my job. Does that make sense? I have a draft paper which I never finished. Why it's important to be an anthropologist as a National Park Service superintendent. I never finished it, but I think it's important because you have to learn the rules, the language, the social cultures, sometimes even the physical anthropology of that Park Service culture to be able to work within it comfortably.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that because I inherited the DARCOM project from a guy who left the Park Service. And this project was incredibly good. It was way, way overdue. It was going to be over budget. And if it hadn't been for Ruthann, we wouldn't have gotten this done. So I just
Thank you, Mark.
In fact, I got for saving the Park Service hundreds of thousands of dollars, I got a $500 cash award. So I thank you for my $500.
I think that's why, Mike, when I first started talking to you, it sounded more like I'd been with the Park Service most of my career, because I have been identified with the Park Service programs so much of my career, though I haven't been in the Park Service itself, as an employee all of that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as I speak to folks at conferences and such and identify myself as a Park Service archaeologist, everyone has a patch of their life for a long period of time or has been in and out. So it's kind of interesting to think about passage of people throughout the discipline in the different realms of the discipline, academic or agency.
One of the problems that I still find in the Park Service is that there is not a good integration, I don't believe, and if anybody can correct me, with the external programs and the national park system. A lot of the people in the park system, in the parks, do not understand the external programs. And I believe that's why we run into problems in the parks with applying NAGPRA or applying cultural landscapes or identifying historic sites and applying National Register criteria, because that's just a little different world that most of them are not well educated about, especially if they start out as park rangers and in law enforcement. They don't understand that other system.
Mm-hmm. Right. So was it kind of exciting for you to come to DC? I mean, did you think of that as something of a fact-finding or an anthropological mission for you?
Well, I got hit by a truck in 1985, and I almost died. And it took several years for my recovery. At that same time, I had the physical issue to deal with. I was working for Woodward Clyde Consultants, which is an international environmental geotech consulting firm in San Francisco. And I was assigned to the Hanford Nuclear Reservation. Congress canceled the nuclear program, so 1,200 of us got pink slips one day. Didn't matter who you worked for, Congress took the money. I had to have a job. And so I'll tell you, when I got the job in D.C., I'd been around the Park Service enough. I thought I understood it. I learned later I didn't understand that much about it, but I was so glad to have a job. I was 50 years old. That's a hard time to be seeking a job for a woman who's out looking at the world. Benny Keel's one of my best friends. I've been very familiar with AAD for many, many years, so it was a comfortable place for me to move into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, neat. Can you compare the work environment and responsibilities of the time you spent in the Park Service with other institutional cultures, other agencies, or other places of work that you've had? How are they different? How are they similar? Which did you enjoy the most?
Well, I enjoy the most working for myself. I've had a little private consulting firm on the side always since 1974. It's never generated much income. I probably was most comfortable when I was working at Woodward Clyde in the private sector because, the first day I went there, I went in and asked for a typewriter. And my boss, who was a good electrical engineer, or actually I think it was mechanical, said, "You have a pencil. That's all you need. You don't need a typewriter. We have secretaries to do the typing." And I went to the secretaries and I said, "Can I get a typewriter?" And they said, "Damn right, so we don't have to do the typing, But I was respected for the income that I brought in, the products I got done, the work I got done. There were a significant number there were no women among the owners. I think I was one of them. But it was just a different, it did not have a traditional institutional history, which you get in academia or the Park Service or BLM. And I was respected more for my own merits. So that's what I was most comfortable in.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Can you talk a little bit about your private consulting firm? What kind of projects you've been taking up over the...
Well, I started out in 1974 doing illustrations. I've always done line drawings of artifacts. Well, since I was working on my PhD and realized that it was cheaper to reproduce line drawings than it was photographs. And I taught myself a lot about rocks when I had to draw the rocks. And then I put together a set of note cards, which I still see on walls today. And it's my plan for my retirement, because I'm going to sell those on eBay or some other internet site when I can't earn any other income. In the meantime, I have done some small projects. I've done some writing projects as contracts under Knudson Associates. I have done some survey and inventory work. I don't do a lot of work for that, but you know what? Since 1974, I've always had a letterhead. I've always had a separate identity. I've always had an IRS tax ID. It's a for-profit firm, not non-profit. But it meant that when I got laid off or I needed to act independently, I always had that independent persona that I could use.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When I was with the Park Service, for instance, in Washington, D.C., I was personally working on some legislation. I could do that through Knudson Associates and help shape the Birds of Prey National Monument legislation with the BLM and some other things. I personally like having my own identification, no matter what else I'm doing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, neat. Great. Can you talk a little bit about Dolores? I did some reading and it's about the project, how massive it was, how long it took. Talk about your role in that project and.
Well, Dolores is big, and sorry, Mark, I think it's even bigger than Darkham. Dolores is a salvage project, like the old River Basin Survey projects, and it was designed by the Bureau of Reclamation to put a dam on the Dolores River in southwest Colorado and back up that reservoir for a huge number of known Pueblo sites. I don't think we ever got any information about anything other than probably 7,000 or 8,000 years, but lots of Pueblos, lots of sites. Dave Brennan's got the contract with the Bureau of Reclamation from the University of Colorado, and he partnered with Bill Light, then at Washington State University, to work on that project. Bill and I, at the same time, were starting the Middle Fork Salmon Project, 78. And after a meeting Bill and I went to in Salmon, Idaho, we're driving back to Pullman, and Bill says, oh, by the way, I can't work on this summer. We just got Dolores. And I sort of went through the VW roof and said, oh, this will be one more Southwest archaeology project. You'll look at the pots, and you'll look at the architecture, and nobody will look at the rocks. So he said, well, I guess we're going to have to bring you in to look at the rocks. So that summer of 78, Bill and I commuted a week at a time between Salmon and Dolores. And I came in on the management team, thank God not as a co-PI, but as one of the senior managers, Al Kane and me and Tim Kohler. And I wrote the lithic design, research design, and then I was one of the team that wrote the project research design and the mitigation design. It's a huge project, and one of the best things about it, I think, is that all the data that were generated smartly to begin with, and with an idea of their long-term curation. They're all now curated at Boulder, I believe, University of Colorado. We learned a lot about the Southwest. Both Bill and Dave had been on the Glen Canyon project, so a lot of it was carryover and techniques and excavation and recordation from Glen Canyon. But I was very pleased to be proud of that for several years. Mm-hmm. And in fact, that's where I got introduced to Woodward Clyde Consultants. They were brought in as a consultant to do the predictive modeling using GIS for modeling where we would put more energy into the excavation and survey. Oh, and then they hired me.
Oh, all right. We're jumping backwards and forwards in the timeline. I apologize. Here's kind of a big picture question. Were there major upheavals or watershed moments in, say, national politics or policy that you experienced in your archaeological career? My question is originally having to do with the Park Service, but in archaeology in general. We've mentioned a few, I think, NHPA, NAGPRA, etc., but could you talk about those?
The most important was probably NEPA. The National Environmental Policy Act in '69 created the need for archaeologists. And I think Larry Banks with the Corps of Engineers, Larry's told me he was probably the first NEPA archaeologist. He was hired in 1970, I believe. Because all of a sudden, within NEPA, it said you had to look at all this historic preservation information. And you had to have people, they were dealing with rivers, reservoirs, and they had lots and lots and lots of archaeology to deal with. I think beyond that, there's a progression of the archaeology programs from reservoir salvage to Moss Bennett to 11593, the 1980 amendments, but it's probably NAGPRA that is the most important in how we relate to our resources and the community associated with those resources.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, can you tell me more about that? I mean, you mentioned repatriation in Idaho in the 70s that you had experienced. So you saw that, and then 10 years later you see it sort of brought into a national level. Could you talk about, I don't know, maybe watching your colleagues react to that, or yourself reacting to that? And
you know, in the late 60s, Washington State University was at the very tail end of the interagency survey projects, river basin survey, the whole salvage program at Marmas. And Rick Sprague and Deward Walker had both been associated with WSU, but they'd gone the 8 miles across the border, and they were at the University of Idaho then. They developed memoranda of agreement between UI and WASO with a number of the tribes, Nez Perce, Colville, I don't know, a number of other ones, to set up a program wherein any human remains were found. There were 2 people that were called immediately. One was the sheriff. One was an elder from the designated elder from the most closely associated Native American reservation. And then first the determination was made whether these remains were probably native. Then if they were native, then the tribal people were more involved, and the agreements were set up with each of those campuses, whereby the remains were turned over the campus with, I believe it is usually 1 year, for the university to do a physical anthropological study of that. And this was before DNA. So DNA sampling, frankly, wasn't an issue. Radiocarbon dating could have been, and that wasn't done. But there was good physical anthropological descriptions of all of the remains. And then the agreement was the university and the tribe would rebury the remains. And it was a very good program.
Wow.
With a lot of respect involved. I went to the University of Idaho in 1974 and was part. Idaho State had archaeological material spread all over the state, but they decided to set up 3 official repositories in the southwest, southeast, and the north. So I got a truck and took it down to Pocatello in the southeast and loaded up all of the artifacts and the remains that were from North Idaho. So we distributed the materials where they were closest to their origin point. Mm-hmm. And so I inherited all the human remains from the Dworshak Reservoir. And so we went through the process. We did the 1-year study, and then we had a reburial out at Nez Perce National Historic Park, which is, within the Nez Perce Reservation. It was all, in fact, Peter White was over from Australia, and when the minister didn't show up, Peter has a preacher's license, and he gave the grace and did all of the religious work, But it was a very cordial relationship, always was, and we didn't have any human remains on the shelves. When I did Anton Rig at the University of Idaho, I returned all of the human remains to the state of South Dakota, and they were ultimately repatriated there. So when I got to Washington State in the 90s, I was used to good relationships between Native people and archaeologists and cultural cultural places, and listened to a lot of the rhetoric that was going on behind the scenes about passage of NAGPRA. I was appalled, frankly, because I don't believe that we own other people's bodies. I think that they ought to have the right to control their remains. And one of the most important thing to me in NAGPRA, and I'm sorry it took that long, is literally the statement that Indian people own their own bodies. It's incredible it took to 1990 to get that a matter of law. Mm-hmm. I did not participate much in that, but I sat across the hall from Tim McEwen in Frank McManaman's office where NAGPRA the regs were being written, the advisory council was being set up. I heard all of those discussions. Then I got to Agate and found myself with the 35 consulting tribes and the 18 sets of human remains, and found it to be a wonderful experience to work through to return those. Those materials have not been returned. They're still at Agate, but all the paperwork's done. All the tribes have to do is request those remains, and they will be given to them.
Right, right. Yeah, that's an amazing passage from seeing where the policy is being written to doing the work of trying to make it work at the level of park.
And it can work quite successfully. You have to be very honest. You have to be very direct. You have to respect the culture of yourself as well as those. I mean, I still remember sitting there in that building in Crawford thinking, I represent the President of the United States. What I say has to be very carefully said. That's just, that's part of the rules.
Right. Okay. So another question, a bit of a topical question, since we're about to face a change in administration, have you felt the broader national political climate affected things in archaeology and preservation, or have you felt more continuity than disruption when administrations change?
Oh, generally it doesn't disrupt that much. What makes a difference is what Congress will do to provide appropriations. Mm-hmm. In the Park Service, the difference that it makes is when either Congress or the President creates more new national parks and monuments, because that dilutes the kitty. That means that you have less money in each unit to do the job that you have to do, and that's why we end up with backlog. I'm very proud of the fact that at Agate, I knew this system well enough that I knew how to write grant proposals. And I think I put $3 million into that little park. And, you know, we have an up-to-date HVAC system in the visitor center. And we have a water line that works all the time. And we have a tornado shelter. And we have new trails, you know. And that was, you know, in the 90s, early 2000s. Money was perhaps a little flush, but there always are going to be limited resources. There's always going to be a maintenance back. What you have to do is learn how to pick and choose your battles, do the best job in your grant writing, and spend the money as effectively as you can, and live with it.
Right.
The emphasis on live with it. And I don't think it's ever going to get much better. There's too big a backlog. I don't see, you know, I sit here in Montana, and hopefully they're going to finish going to the Sun Road next year. Now that's been, 5 years? It's just, there's too much to do.
Yeah.
But the one thing as a park superintendent you think about, and you don't tend to think about that as the archaeologist, how much it costs. What can it do? How can it benefit the visitor? You have to think more like a manager. And you may not get the archaeological resource plan done, but you get the water line built.
Right. Yeah, that's quite a jump from archaeologist to superintendent as a manager.
And I think I was luckier because I'd been in private industry before. When you do EISs and EAs and you learn how the dollars and the pennies and everything run together, you think about it differently. Yeah, right.
Yeah, going along that lines, can you talk about maybe the benefits you felt like you've had jumping around from agency work to consulting work to academia? How has that affected the way you look at research or the discipline of archaeology?
I have always found it extremely important to be an anthropologist. I think that as anthropologists, we learn about other cultures, and if we're smart, we learn how to ourselves operate in other cultures, because each culture is different. It's different in the Park Service. Actually, it's different between the Park Service and the BLM and the Forest Service. But it's different being in a federal agency and being in a government agency. I mean, I learned to build pipelines. I used to be the tour guide for Shell out in the pipelines in New Mexico because they thought I could explain it in lay language, not worrying about the details of the archaeological site, which unfortunately we had just plowed through, but talk about the benefits of that pipeline, how all the communities came together to make a decision to build it, how some of the impacts were being mitigated, how it operated in the real world. I have always found in moving from one place to another that things I learned in the other context were useful. Things I learned in DARCOM at the Parks at Woodward Clyde were extremely important when I was at the Park Service and detailed to the Department of Defense Legacy Program. Mm-hmm. It was extremely important that I knew a lot of that when I was putting together the Federal Archaeological Report to Congress, which is a combination of dollars and data reports and things like that. And as much as anything else, I think you learn to talk to everybody. You learn not to be arrogant about a context you're in. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And Indians are everywhere. Dealing with Native people since I was a child to being working at University of Idaho in the early 70s when I was digging on a site on Nez Perce land with Nez Perce crew, to working with Shell Cortez at Woodward Clyde when I was explaining that CO2 was the fizzy and pop and why you put it in a pipeline, to dealing with Department of Defense and Vine Deloria about sacred sites and why they were important, need to take them into consideration. Those all seem to carry over one to the other. I think most people find that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Neat. Okay, I got a couple more questions, and then I want to encourage folks to ask some questions. But just how would you characterize the role of the National Park Service in the discipline of archaeology? The relationship between the research that's done in the Park Service, or the and the academic world, or the collection of general knowledge of archaeology.
My experience with the park archaeology is that it's very site-specific. That's the mission of the Park Service. It is not the mission to write a synthesis of Plains archaeology, of Northwest archaeology. That's also true in the private sector. Depending on the report, some have more information that is broadly applicable, but most of it tends to get into very site-specific. It's the academic world that I think has the responsibility to do the synthesis, to put together, to put big pictures together, and then it's the responsibility of the individual archaeologist, no matter what role she or he is in, to make their own decisions about what they're going to do for research, how they're going to do their writing, where they're going to make the investment of themselves in it. I kind of like being the new Marie Wormington, though I'm getting older than she was, because I see lots of things, I can compare lots of things. To me, that's my privilege, to be able to look at all of that and see all of that. The only place I see that being possible is generally within the academic environment. And I just don't know how much encouragement there is for that there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, great.
We just don't get much synthesis from anybody in any world because we're all involved in things that have to have a deadline today and are paid for out of a certain kitty. And, other than ACLS or somebody, maybe NSF, and that's not often, people just aren't going to pay for somebody to take the time to really sit down and write and do big things. I think the only people that do are people that teach those general courses on campus and are forced together to put notes that they tend to turn into a textbook.
Right. Great. Do folks out there in the world have some questions for Ruthann? Remember to turn your mic on if it's off.
Hi, Mike. This is Karen Mudar. Can you
Hey,
hear
Karen.
me?
Yes,
Yes.
I can hear you.
Okay. Sorry, I've had to bounce between different kinds of technology here. I wanted to say hey to Ruthann. I met
Hi.
her in the late 70s. I don't know what exactly brought you to the gorge, but I was with Jenny Harris at the time. I don't know if you remember her or me, but it's awfully nice to hear from you again.
Thank you.
And I wondered if you would comment on a little bit more on your role as a female in the Washington office, because my understanding is that you were kind of a glass ceiling breaker there as well.
Oh my.
Is that true? I think it's true. Weren't you the first female?
Well, Terry Childs was there, and Val Knudson was there.
Oh, they were there already. Okay.
They were there when I came. And I don't know, but I think before us, I'm not sure there were. Oh yes, there was, of course. Benny had a couple of women. Oh, she'll kill me because I can't remember.
What about Crespi?
Yeah. Well, yeah, but
She was the anthropologist.
She was anthropology. Sort of.
That was
Joe
a glass
Watt
break-in.
job. But
Yeah.
it was. What's her name? You know her, Mark. Anyway, Benny had a couple of women working for him in the 80s. Good, strong women too, and I, chose my age. I can't remember their name, but
Michelle Aubry.
Pardon?
Michelle Aubry.
Well, yes, Michelle was there, but she was over working for what's his name?
Roy Reeves.
Yeah. No, but she didn't work for Frank or Benny. Well, she worked for Benny. That's right.
Yeah.
She worked for Benny. And then she moved over to work for, what's his name, and went to Southern California. Was with Mickey Crespi. Well, somebody will straighten that out anyway.
And Houston?
No, she wasn't.
Wow, you guys are naming names I'm not familiar with.
Yeah, some of them aren't with among the living anymore.
Yeah.
No. I find so many are from my age group are not among the living. They're still
Stephanie
constant
Toothman?
conversions.
Stephanie
Pardon?
Toothman?
She was in Seattle then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was really sorry to hear that Leslie Wilderson has passed.
She died of breast cancer almost 2 years ago.
Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that.
Yeah. She was she took an experimental drug and was down to 90 pounds.
Oh,
And Janet Friedman died of leukemia 6-7 years ago. And she was that time she was the Federal Preservation Officer for the Forest Service. Of the rest of the Pullman cohort, Judy Benz is finishing her last 6th year as president of the University of West Florida.
Stephanie Rutherford.
Taft is, I think, just about to retire as director of the Western Archaeological Conservation Center. And Lorraine Hartfield is retired, but she does some consulting work, and she's in Arkansas. But the four of us that are left still get together. I just got birthday messages from everybody. And I think it's our cohorts that we develop that are our strongest support. I don't know if you've seen Ruthann. Dave, what's his name? He has that book on women in archaeology up to 1940.
No, I haven't seen it.
It's a good book, and he comments on how the cohorts were most important to those women, and it is certainly. And when I reviewed his book in Paleoanthropologist, and I commented on our WSU cohort because it was certainly. It has been for our entire careers the strongest support we could have had. You know, I remember each of us has gotten fired at some point or another, and we've always had somebody, you know, to rely on and to make phone calls. But I must say the guys have just as good. Ken Ames called me every week after I got hit by the truck for a year, just to see how I was doing. You know, the camaraderie is always great, no matter what the gender, but it's a little bitter for us girls sometimes. You guys have your own networks. I know. So, and if you haven't seen it, I have a book on the women in the river basin surveys. It's in the Damned If They Do or something. It's a Left Coast Press, came out a couple of years ago, that you can pick up on the web. And there were an amazing number of women who got started in American archaeology during the River Basin Survey Program. They were not employees of the federal government because it was federal policy in almost all of the offices not to hire women. But there were cooperating organizations. There were museums or state historical societies, and they hired the women. Dina Dinkos, for instance, was... Dick Wheeler in 1955 at Oahe. Ruth Groon. I was on a bus with her a couple of years ago at SAA meeting, and I said I was doing this book, and I said, I don't know if you know anything about it. She said, oh yeah, I was at Wake 'em Up in 1955. She's on the trip down to the gorge. You know, and then of course at Glen Canyon, Jess Jennings just thought the canyon was too dangerous for women. It just absolutely was too dangerous. So Deanne Soom, who had a PhD from the UCLA by that point, was in the lab all the time because it was too dangerous for her to be down in the canyon. You know, but so many women came out of that time period because they got their start, they got their interest, and they got their networks built up and those relationships that carry them the rest of their careers.
Neat.
And I'm sorry, Karen, I don't remember what project that was.
Oh, that's all right. It was a long time ago. Would
yeah, it
you,
was.
If there's no other questions right now, would you mind commenting on specifically how archaeology or how you related to archaeology while you were a superintendent?
Oh, yeah, I mean, archaeology's in my blood. I never not do it. We did not have much at Agate, but I can tell you, I never walked across a trail without looking at the ground. And I found a few arrowheads and a few flakes. At the same time I was being a superintendent, I was at home writing an article on red smoke. I forgot I was doing some other things too. I got an archaeological plan started. You know, little parks, I mean, we had an FTE of 2 and an annual budget of $500,000 and 4,000 acres. 15,000 guests a year. And the ones I always like, my proverbial guest is the pipe fitter from New Jersey, who was absolutely terrified of being out in the high plains with no walls. You know, but I did bring in an intern to do an archaeological management plan, and she got it, of course, about 80% done, and then I retired, and it never got quite done. It's still sitting there to be done. I did get the park formally determined to be a cultural landscape, which I consider a significant achievement, as important as, and that includes the archaeological materials as well as the historic buildings, a National Register listed cabin, the paleontological resources. I did get a Native American evaluation of the fossil materials, and there's a book called Fossil Legends of the First Americans. Very good book. And we're in that because Branko LeBeau came in and gave me a written documentation of the agate Miocene mammalian beds as being the source of the Lakota crazy buffalo mythology. Those are 20-million-year-old Miocene beds. I don't think the Lakota had probably been there more than a few hundred years. But when they came in, they saw the same old bones that our visitors see that have been there forever, and they created their stories. So I didn't do archaeology per se because there wasn't a lot of it, but I was always doing anthropology. If I'd been up in Voyager, I would have done something different. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's really interesting talking to superintendents who are archaeologists because they feel like they have a sort of a different relationship with their resource or their park as a result. And some have said that they, especially those that have a lot of significant archaeological resources, that from that sort of vantage point they can be better advocates for them. And it sounds like you had the same experience.
I did.
Well, congratulations on getting all of that, the cultural landscape recognized. That must have been a heavy lift.
Actually, it wasn't. I got all the NAGPR work done. I got the cultural landscape done because Agate is such a small park. And I was the girl out in the park, It was a GS-12, and they didn't pay attention. The Midwest region, I wasn't causing a problem, so they didn't pay attention. So I could pretty much do what I mean, that's how I got a lot of the money. I mean, I knew how to write any grant proposal you want, so the handicapped could benefit from it. And if the handicapped benefit from it, it ranks higher. and I can't think of her name. I know her well. Anyway, the gal interested in cultural landscape was very interested because Agate has within it the historic Cook Ranch, and actually Harold Cook was at Folsom. His brother-in-law. Boy, I'm having a name tag today. I find that dude getting older. Anyway, I'd known him for 40 years. So I had ties to that family and that ranch, too, before I even came into the park. Before I came to that park, I had emails from Calgary telling me they heard I was going to the park because they had geologists up there that knew people that knew people that knew people, It's just, there's some real benefits to not being too high in the totem pole. And it's a wonderful place to live. I think that made me a much better anthropologist and archaeologist for the rest of my life because I lived out on the high plains 12 months a year. I was 50 miles from Scottsbluff. I was at a McDonald's. I had wild plums. I had deer. I had coyotes. I was 4 miles from the closest house. I was often the only one out there by myself. I learned a different appreciation for, evaluation for life on the high plains. It's different if you live in it, And we had wonderful Christmas events, and they're still going. I know I'm off, but you're not asking questions, so interrupt me anytime. The cookhouse, name forgotten, had come from Canada, where they celebrate Boxing Day. So I started a habit of practicing Boxing Day, and if you know that's the day after Christmas, when traditionally the English well-to-do give gifts to their servants. So we established Boxing Day, and we invited the whole neighborhood in. I've had up to 150 there, driving through blizzards to get there. And we would provide the food, and we'd take contributions if they wanted it. And it was just a party, and we'd get big tumbleweeds and put ribbons on it for Christmas. And it worked all the time. It changed relationships between a federal unit in a private ranch landscape in probably ways nothing else could have, because it was a social relationship, not just a administrative managerial relationship.
Neat.
I also, thinking of being an anthropologist there, I started a artist in residence program my first year, and that is still going, because there are 5 houses at Agate, 4 new ones, and so we could bring artists in and we could house them for 3 days, and they could do art and sell art in the park. And we got some very, very good artists, they still do now, who come in during the summer at various times. Sometimes there are a couple of them each summer. And that gives a connection between the guests, the Indian people, and the Red Cloud ethnographic artifact collection there. Gives a continuity that you need, so it's just not so disconnected. Mm-hmm. That's a terrible sentence, but sorry. Mm-hmm. So, Karen left, okay.
No, I'm still here.
Oh, good. What do you do now?
Me?
Yeah.
I work in WASO, in the archaeology program in WASO.
Oh, okay.
And I was working on the second powerhouse of the Bonneville Dam.
Oh, were you?
And the archaeology project there when I met you. But you were friends with the woman that I lived with. And we came and visited you a couple of times when you were living in Portland, I think.
No, that was Leslie.
Leslie was living in Portland. That's right. We met you there.
Yeah, because I was in Moscow, Pullman in Moscow.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I won't ask you questions. I'm the interviewee.
Well, thank you very much for answering my questions. It's been a treat to talk to you.
Oh, yes. So do you like living in the East Coast?
Me?
Yeah.
Karen?
Yeah.
Not so much. No.
That's why I wanted to leave.
Yes, I can understand that. It's beautiful out in the west and the northwest. But there's pretty places. There's very nice places in the east as well.
Oh, yeah, and I got one of those Smithsonian Associates things, where they take you out for a weekend. If you WASO folks haven't been on them, that's always the thing. And they take you in a bus, and they have docents whose greatest event of the day is after you're on your way home. They come down the aisle and they serve little thumbnails of sherry or ginger ale and peanut butter crackers. That's your Smithsonian adventure.
Wow, they knocked themselves out, didn't they?
They do. But I got to see a lot of places around D.C. Botanical gardens and the Rappahannock on the Tappahannock, and
Oh,
it's fun.
Nice.
I think that one of the nice things about the Park Service is there are so many ways to go in and out of it. You can be an employee, you can be a contractor, you can be in external programs, you can be in the park system. It's a very complicated organization, and there are many ways you can participate in it and find a niche that's comfortable for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Ruthann, can you, it seems like, well, you've never actually retired, and as I know, you're running a million projects, or starting up a million things, or continuing a million things. Can you talk about some of the things that you're working on now, including some...
Well, I'm happy to say the Plainview book is in press. It will be out next September. I'm a co-editor of that and the author of the primary, I think, of course, primary chapter on the Plainview points. I am in the process of, and Mark's working on that with me, I hope, a National Historic Landmark nomination for the Red Smoke, Lime Creek, Allen, and a couple other sites in the Medicine Creek Reservoir in southwest Nebraska.
You can count on
Virgil
me.
Lopez working on that with me, and Mike's working with that with me, because those 3 sites were dug in 48 to 54 under salvage conditions, They're under 60 feet of dirt. There is stuff left there. There's some of the most important Paleoindian sites in North America, and we want to get them nominated. I'm also working on, I had cancer a few years ago, and that kind of interrupted a bunch of things, but I'm back. We're working on a publication of Mott Davis's dissertation on the Medicine Creek salvage excavations, including all of his field reports, which Midwac was wonderful enough to get me photos of and all that work. I also have taken on Les Davison's Barton Gulch work. Les died a year or so ago. And Barton Gulch is a site down in southwest Montana that's 10,400 years old, and its lower level. It's got 3 components. And it has 16 roasting pits in it that have plant materials and deer. And I was down there last weekend and driving around that country, and I teach Montana Indians, and I had just given a lecture. And I got thinking, why are they over the edge down in that valley and not up in the Big Hole? And I'm wondering if maybe they weren't Uto-Aztecan speakers, because there are artifacts like that down at Mummy Cave in the Birch Creek area. And they were staying out of the Big Hole country because that was Algonquian country. I think we can talk about, at least in my part of the world now, language groups, at least way, way back in the past, because the Algonquian speakers have probably been here in place for 15,000 years. They haven't moved around, so I need to get that done. And as part of, related to that, Rob Bonnickson also died, and he was working on Everson Creek, and that's down in the very bottom of the Big Hole, and that's Cody, and it's a huge, big quarry site. I suspect that's the Algonquians down in there. They're interesting to work with. So I teach. I teach at Montana State University, Great Falls. I teach Montana Indians, and I've taught that. This is my 7th year. And this spring, if the class makes, I'm going to teach Native American religion. And I've also been asked to teach Montana Indians at University of Great Falls. So, and when I went to the Plains Conference, I killed the engine of my car. So I need to do that to pay for the car. I mean, at my age, there's got to be an ulterior motive.
Great.
Oh, and I owe 2 papers to Mammoth Trumpet. I think the second one may be out this week on Plainview. And then I'm doing 2 papers on Goshen here in the Northern Plains. Now that we're finally beginning to understand that the first occupation of North America came through the West Coast and came up that Columbia River Gorge. Thank God the dams weren't there. That the earliest occupations are across North America, across that northern tier of Washington, Idaho, Montana. And here in Montana, they met the eroding edge of the Laurentide ice sheet. So it was a very lakey, lacustrine environment. That's completely different from our image of Clovis First, Southern Plains, dry environments. So we have to look at all of the archaeology up here very, very differently. We've not done that. We're looking at Paisley Cave, beginning to understand that. There's that Deer Creek site now up in the Seattle area that has points that they're calling western stemmed. I would call them Goshen. There are sites up in Alberta that Jack Ives says adamantly are all fluted. Well, they're all kinds of, quote, flutes, unquote. I think a lot of them are Goshen, as well as maybe more Clovis or Folsom Plain. There seems to be maybe a 5,000, 4,000 year period from about 15,000 years ago to 11 to 10,000 years ago, where we have a point here and a point there, and we know there are people all across that area. Eastern Montana, we have a 14,000-year-old site at Lindsay. So we need to think about that, and I'm going to say in my Goshen paper, these are a few sites we call Goshen, but mostly we need to open our mind and ask different questions and not just use Marie 57, Wilmington 57, Mother Marie, to put labels on things, because I think we will find exciting discoveries in our data if we think differently about the questions we're asking. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
I can get off on that for a long time.
A lot of work to do.
Ruthann and Mike, this is Ann Hitchcock. Can you hear me?
Oh, I can. Hi.
Hi.
Hi. I've been having trouble with my microphone, and you were trying to think of a name and who Michelle Aubrey worked for. I think it was Doug Scoville you were trying to
Yes,
think
it
of.
was.
Okay.
Yes, it was.
I don't have a question. I just wanted to mention that name, and I've certainly enjoyed your presentation. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
It's
But who is there?
Trip through history.
But there was another woman. There was Val Canout, Terry Child, and me. There was another. She worked for Benny in the 80s. Oh well.
Barbara Seagrave. Was it Barbara Seagrave?
No, I think she was one, but I can't think of who it was.
It wasn't Barbara. It wasn't Nichols. Marilyn Nichols, was it?
No.
No. Good. Okay.
Her husband's an archaeologist at Maryland. Was an archaeologist at Maryland.
Oh, Barbara Little.
Barbara Little.
No, 20 years before. Well, we'll have to go back in history. And Mike, I lost you.
Oh. Yeah, the cameras are getting a little funny. You
Okay.
are popping in and out, so.
Her first name begins with an A, and
Oh, I don't know. I'll try and think of it, but I can't at the moment.
well,
Great.
But I enjoyed your review back through and naming lots of names of people who I enjoyed in my career as well. Enjoyed knowing. So it was really wonderful to go on this journey with you today.
Great.
Well,
go ahead.
No, I say I've been around the WASO office for 40 years. So, Jerry Rogers was the name I was trying to think of earlier. That was a conversation with Mike. Yeah. And Jerry's still kicking, I think, in Santa Fe.
Yeah, he's in Santa Fe. He retired there.
Yeah.
He's involved with the Archaeological Conservancy there and protecting a site that's not too far from his house. And he's also involved with being an advocate for night skies.
Oh, that's right. Yes. And I'm involved with the Conservancy. They own Red Smoke. And they also, Les Davis and his wife donated the McAfee site here in Montana to the Conservancy. So I work with them on those. My copious spare time.
I worked with the Conservancy on the Borax Lake site out in California.
Oh, that's right, you did.
Yeah, they're a really good group.
Any other questions, Mike?
I think I'm good. Anybody out there have questions?
I think we're good.
Are you good? Well, maybe we can wrap up.
Yeah, Mike, this is Ann.
Ann.
Let me ask a question. I had trouble with my audio at the very beginning. I missed the beginning of it. But, Ruthann, can you comment a little bit about what you accomplished with the museum collections at Agate when you were there?
Those museum collections are really in pretty good shape. That building was built in, I think it was finished in 89 or 90. And so it has a very good curatorial department, you know. I had applied for rolling shells when I left. I think they may have gotten those. I don't know. But it was a very good setup. I didn't do much with it because everything was pretty well set up at that point. other than opening it up and, opening it up to the Indians so they could see what there was. I repatriated a skull to the Lower Elwha Clallam in Washington State, which they promptly took across to British Columbia and reburied in its original find spot. It was found in Canada, but they're the same tribe on both sides of the border, so we made that work. And I repatriated 2 scalps to the Pawnee and 1 scalp to the Blackfeet. 1 scalp is still there. The Crow have signed all the papers, so they only have to request the repatriation, but the Crow have 2 very different factions on the reservation. By the way, I've chaired the Montana Burial Board for the last 2 years. I've been on it for 6. And the Crow that I was dealing with in 2000 wanted it repatriated. The Crow today do not want it repatriated, so it stays at Agate. All of the 17 or 18 sets of remains are also still at Agate. It was a group request. I had designated a burial area and started the EA. It has not been finished, and I think the tribes are comfortable with the remains being there because it's a good curatorial facility. They're treated with respect. They know they're safe, and they just have enough other problems, My main curatorial thing was years before I got the Park Service when I was at the University of Idaho and went there in 74, and we had nothing for shelving. And that's when I had to go and salvage lumber out of a church that was being built nearby and build shelving for the lab and build boxes for the lab so we could have a curatorial facility. My main achievement.
Thank you.
Great. Well, if we have any other questions out there, maybe we can end for the day. Thank you so much, Ruthann, for talking with me and for participating and sharing all your stories. I've enjoyed all the planning that's gone up to this. So keep in contact. I'm sure we'll talk about Red Smoke and Medicine Creek, and looking forward to upcoming publications. So thanks, everyone, for participating, asking great questions. Our next presentation will be November 10th. Jay Sturdivant and Don Bringelson of MWAC are going to talk about ArcheoBlitz, which should be a lot of fun. They're going to show a short film about it and talk about research and engagement and all these other things. So thanks, everyone, and have a good rest of your evening. Thanks, Ruthann.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Bye-bye.
Thank you much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.